My family's lived here in Kentucky since before we kicked the British out. That's almost 300 years of calling these hills home. We haven't always had it easy, but we're darn proud of our heritage, and although we keep our fair share of tradition, a lot's changed over the years. To me, the biggest change is what we do for a living. My dad, may he rest in peace, drove trucks for a living. Me and my brother, on the other hand, we work in fast food and IT, respectively. But our grandpappy was a miner. He's become kind of a legend in our family for obvious reasons. Dude spent 6 days a week down in a deep, dark pit, working his butt off so all of his kids could have a better life. And you know what? It worked. Not a single member of our family worked the mines after he did, as he basically made it off limits for us. But that's not so much because it was backbreaking work, more because of something he experienced down there when he was still just a teenager. So like I touched on, Grandpappy started working the mines when he was basically still a kid. Sure, I thought 17 was incredibly grown up when I was that age, but then you hit 30 and realize, yeah, 17 and you're still a freaking baby. He was just a kid going to work with grown men, dudes double or sometimes almost triple his age. Not only that, but our family aren't exactly known for our stature. A clan of baby faces, but tall we are not. So as you can guess, those first few weeks were real intimidating for him. Not only that, but the biggest, meanest SOB in the whole place took an instant disliking to him. And as bad as that sounds, Grandpap had no idea what kind of doom that spelled for him. This guy's name was like Tex or Rex or something, but everyone called him Arthur since that was his second name. Arthur was a bully. He'd borrow money from guys and they just knew that they'd never get it back. But it was either give it to him or you were the one he was picking a fight with down at the bar come Friday night. Trouble was, there was no firing the guy. He hauled more coal out of that freaking mine than anyone, and when Arthur was on shift, there was considerably less horseplay. So as much as the bosses knew everyone hated him, Arthur was making the owners a ton of cash, so getting rid of him was completely out of the question. And as the story goes, Arthur took a creepy liking to my grandpap. The exact nature of that liking is something that's not really gone into detail about, and if you ask me, that's for good reason. But I always got the feeling that it was like a Shawshank Redemption / The Sisters kind of liking. If you get the reference, cool. If you don't, well, good for you. Never lose your innocence. Anyway, Grandpappy was warned by a lot of coworkers, never let Arthur get you alone, but they never tell him exactly why. Being a smarter kid, he didn't ask too many questions, he just did as they advised. But from what I understand, it was only a matter of time before his luck ran out. The way my dad tells the story, at the end of one of their shifts, Arthur walks up to one of the pit bosses, then whispers something in his ear. The pit boss looks like he'd seen a ghost, and then walks right over to my grandpappy, who's still 17 at the time, and tells him he needs to go back down into the mine to fetch a length of cable that someone had forgotten. Now right away, you can probably tell that something's wrong here. It's just a piece of cable, right? No reason why the next shift couldn't grab it when they went down. And it was a mine, for Christ's sake. They have cable for days, why get all antsy over one little piece? But again, my grandpap wasn't one to ask too many questions, so he does as the pit boss told him and headed back down to the mine to fetch the cable. He walks down into the dark, spends a few minutes looking for the piece of cable, but can't find anything. Then right as he's about to turn back to tell his pit boss that he can't find the cable, his way is blocked by, you guessed it, Arthur. Arthur tells him not to move and not to scream. If he did, he was going to have an accident, quote unquote. My grandpap knew better than to try and fight Arthur, and he also knew better than to scream loud underground. Besides, Arthur had this absolutely terrifying presence, and almost everything he said had the undertone of, "Do it or I'll snap your neck." My grandpa must have been shaking like a leaf as he slowly approached, and I imagine he felt sick to his stomach as Arthur told him to close his eyes. He did, and I'm guessing he didn't know what was coming, only that it was going to be bad. He waited and waited, just hoping whatever it was going to be over quick. But nothing happened. Then, he opens his eyes, and Arthur is gone. I'm guessing he breathed this huge sigh of relief, thinking whatever just happened was part of some nasty prank. Grandpappy knew that Arthur liked to scare people, so maybe he'd just gotten his fear fix, then sneak back up to the surface to yuck it up with the rest of the crew. He was pretty livid as he walked back up to the surface, thinking he'd just had a prank pulled on him. But when he gets there, he hears the last question he expected to. "Hey, Watson, where's Arthur?" Obviously, Grandpappy had no idea and tells the guy he figured Arthur had walked out of the mine. And that's when he realizes no one had seen Arthur re-emerge. They'd seen him walk down after my grandpa, all right, and they knew better than to say anything or to try and stop him. The thing is, they never saw him come back out. My grandpa was the last one to see him down there. When they're asking him, like, "Where's Arthur?" and my grandpappy is saying he didn't know, they all start laughing like, "Aha, kid, but seriously, where is he?" But Grandpa has to tell them that he doesn't know, that Arthur just basically disappeared. When folks realized that, a gang of miners went right back down into the mine to look for Arthur, all the while my grandpa was interrogated on where Arthur went. It seemed unbelievable that my grandpa would be able to defend himself against Arthur, so it was no surprise that no blood or body was found down there. But the fact that he just seemed to have totally disappeared had people more than just scratching their heads. People quickly went from head scratching to straight up terrified since, like I said, Arthur had basically disappeared. He didn't have any family, so there's no one to keep up a stink about it. Only folks that really cared here were the mine's management, who wanted to prevent more stuff like that happening, and then the cops. Cops showed up, questioned my grandpa, but all he could tell them was the same thing he told everyone else. One second, Arthur was there. The next second, he was gone. They asked him if there was a bang, a fall, a scream, anything that might give them a clue as to what happened, but my grandpa just repeated, "There 1 second, gone the next." The way my dad explains it, Grandpa was scared he was going to be arrested for murder or something, so he didn't much care what had actually happened to Arthur, only that he proved he had nothing to do with it. It wasn't until much later that he really started to wonder. It started with one of the other miners telling him something like, "Hey, good job with Arthur. Guy was always a bully. But what is it you did exactly?" All Grandpappy could do was repeat the line about him not having touched the guy, but no one in that camp was ever satisfied by that answer. Then there were the old-timers who told him that the Knockers took Arthur. The Knockers are supposed to be these weird little monsters who live in the mines. Some of the older generation used to believe in them like the gospel, but it can't be anything more than a myth. The legend says that the Knockers were mostly just mischievous, stealing miners' gear if they put stuff down and turned their back. That's obviously just a cover for miners with sticky fingers, like, "It wasn't me that stole your lamp oil, it was the Knockers." But the legend also says that they would help lost or trapped miners by guiding them to the surface. They do this by knocking on the walls of the mine shaft, so all you'd hear in the dark was knock, knock, knock. And if you had the balls to follow the sound, you'd be saved. Basically, Knockers are supposed to be little rascals with hearts of gold, and that's why the old-timers thought the Knockers had saved my grandpappy. Or rather, they didn't just think they saved him, they figured they took Arthur, just like they took stuff that wasn't nailed down. Another reason my grandpa didn't really question the whole thing was that everyone was extra nice to him after that. There was no more disrespecting the new kid, no more giving him all the terrible jobs or making him the general dog's body. That suited Grandpa down to the ground, and so why mess up a good thing? In the end, no one ever found out what happened to Arthur, and it became a warning that other miners would warn each other about. Act up, bully younger miners, shirk your work, and the knockers will take you just like they took Arthur. Big, 6 foot something, $2 and change Arthur, who could have crushed Grandpappy's skull with his bare hands, snatched up, disappeared, without so much as a squeak. Honestly, I'd give my left nut to find out what happened to him, or if the story is even true in the first place. I don't think my grandpa was a killer. In the brief time that I knew him, he seemed gentle and kind. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't something else lurking down there. Something that was more than capable of taking a guy and making him vanish. I've been into caving for quite some time now, but not in the way you might think. I got stuck a little while back and it really scared me, so I only ever explore things like abandoned mines now. Places where I can actually walk through without fear of getting stuck. I find it's just as creepy and exciting without all the dangers. So, this one time, me and my girlfriend, now wife, were exploring an abandoned lead mine located in the old lead mine belt here in our home state, Missouri. We entered via an adit, what we call the entrance to a mine, much lower down the hillside than the regularly used entrance, and did so in order to see the lower workings that are not normally accessible from the higher adit. After a few minutes walking deeper and deeper into the mine, I came to what I thought was the base of a stope, think like a thin step, that I had seen before from the upper entrance. Making my way along this for a little under 20 or 30 yards, I found myself marveling at the flowstone deposits. But I should have been looking where I was going because I suddenly felt the floor of the stope start to buckle under my weight. The stope was covered in centuries of mud and debris, as is normal in mines, but solid mud or earth doesn't just buckle, right? What does buckle like that is wood. Old, rotten wood. It suddenly hit me that I wasn't at the base of the stope. I was actually on an old wooden false floor. Not just that, I had absolutely zero clue how far down the drop was. Like it could have been 4 foot, or it was just as easily could have been 40. Either way, I got this quivery, sick feeling all over me that screamed, I'm about to die, or at least get extremely hurt. It took everything I had in me to keep calm and gently retrace my steps back up the stope. I felt like I was on a frozen lake and all the ice around me was slowly cracking, and it's just a matter of time before I fall and everything goes black. Looking back, it's hard to get my head around the fact that all that stood between me and the great beyond was a bunch of 100-plus-year-old half-rotten wood. And how or why I didn't just crumble into splinters under my weight, I'll never know. All I know is that when I suddenly felt solid rock underneath me again, it was like all the birthdays I've ever had combined. It was being high on life, pure relief, like nothing I've ever felt before or since. After that, me and my wife backed away from the stope and back up towards the surface. I was still shaking when we walked back out into the daylight, so scared I could barely get the words out to tell her what had happened. She was pretty freaked out too, asking me like, what happened? What did you see? And when I could finally tell her, she just brought me in for this big hug because she knew exactly what I must have been feeling. I already knew I wanted to marry her, but that little incident just confirmed it. The fact that she was there for me after the scariest moment of my life. Anyway, I hope I managed to paint a picture of how terrifying that day was for me. But even if this story sucked and me and Emma, my wife, are so grateful for all your hard work, let's read. We are and always will be proud members of the Buttersock cult. I've had some pretty hair-raising experiences while caving, but there was one thing me and my crew found in an old abandoned mine that really had us freaking out. So, picture the scene. We're just about ready to leave this one place near Nuttleburg Mines down in West Virginia when my buddy finds this one crawl tunnel that we hadn't explored yet. He's like my total mini-me, so like a whole 1.5 feet shorter. We usually just give him a good ribbing for it, but good God if he can't reach places we can't during caving adventures. He crawls through with his phone in hand, ready to take pictures of anything cool he sees when we suddenly hear, "Oh my God, bro." We're all like, "What? What is it, dude?" But he carries on. "What in the actual F? Who would..." And we're going crazy, asking him, "Dude, what are you seeing? Take a picture." Barely able to contain our excitement. But he calls back, "I don't think y'all want to see this." We thought he was hyping it up, so naturally we did want to see what he was talking about. We see some flashes of him taking pictures, then he crawls back to us like, "We need to get out of here. Like right now." We're basically demanding he show us the pictures, and he's totally refusing until we're safely out of the mine. Then we're out, and he still refuses, looking over his shoulder like, let's go, we gotta move." Only when we're at a safe distance away and kind of near the car does he actually get his phone out to show us what he'd seen. And yep, he was right. In fact, I don't think we ever should have gone near that place in the first place. The first thing he shows us was this, and I'll do my best to describe it, but forgive me if it sounds totally nuts. Pictures of a bunch of crow's wings arranged like a star. Maybe 8 or 9 of them arranged in a circle and tied or glued together somehow. Then in the middle was an eye, maybe a sheep or a goat's eye, and it looked like it had been embalmed somehow. Like it was all glassy, shiny, and kind of yellow from age, but it had obviously been preserved somehow. It looked like a talisman or something. But what came next was even worse. Someone had caught and killed a bunch of small animals. Mice, frogs, fish, small birds, all kinds of things. Then they'd skin them, debone them, and embalm them somehow, all before either tying or gluing them back together in ways that were far from random. I remember seeing a dried fish head that had been stuck to the body of a rat or mouse, and whoever was crazy enough to do that had stuck on frog's legs near the mouse's tail. It was weird, but it looked kind of dumb, so it had this nuts but harmless mad scientist vibe to it, something that brought on a few nervous giggles. But the next one changed the mood completely. Ted, the guy who crawled and took the pictures, his name is Rob, but we called him Stunted, so Ted for short. Ted was still freaked out because he'd actually saw everything with his own eyes, so he was pretty focused to show us the next one so we'd all be in the same headspace. And by God, did it do the job. The guy had made some kind of doll. I mean, I'm assuming it's a guy. It's usually guys who make messed up stuff like that, just how it's mostly guys that end up as serial killers. It looked like he'd rearranged a rat skeleton to be standing more upright, straightening the legs out, bending the spine back, stuff like that. I don't know how, but the skull seemed to be smiling or something. I figured that was just the natural way the jaw was set, but even so, it wasn't nearly the creepiest thing about it. The hair on its head, the bushy little fro-type thing, I'm almost certain it was made of spiders, or at least some kind of crawling insect. Then, and this bit really screwed with my ex, I think the guy had skinned and tanned the skin of whatever rodent it was, then had dressed things up again with the skin, gave it like a little dress and a tube top type thing. I swear to God, I've never seen anything so freaky in my entire life, not even the most messed up Korean gore-fest horror movie. Ted was so messed up by it that he actually deleted his own photos of the things. I asked him if he'd send them over since my brother didn't believe me. Come to think of it, you guys probably don't believe me either, but he deleted them. Said even having that kind of stuff on his phone was like a curse or something, and that it might lead whoever made them back to him. I told him that was just paranoia talking, but I don't know. I think if I had found them and been face to face with them, that it might have made me a little paranoid too. Someone doing that kind of stuff to animals, they have to just be itching to do it to a person. And that's the big lesson from serial killers anyway. People who do stuff to animals, it all just is a test run, or a build-up to doing it to bigger animals. Then it's bigger and bigger until boom. One day it's a person getting snuffed out, skinned, then embalmed, all before getting toyed with like some rotten life-size doll. Like I said earlier, there haven't been many people who have actually taken me at my word on this. I suppose it makes too good of a creepy campfire story or whatever. Honestly, I don't really care if people believe me or not. I have nothing to prove, and I'm not insecure enough to feel the need to prove it. Besides, I'm always satisfied with getting the listener to promise that they'll never go near abandoned mines in West Virginia or anywhere else for that matter. Because I can promise you, there's way worse stuff than coal dust and pitfalls out there. Stuff that I'm not even sure the smartest psychologists could ever explain. I've always been into caving, and some of the best caves you can explore happen to be either abandoned or half-excavated mines. This usually happened when a silver or gold deposit was much smaller than the diggers first imagined, or if a mine turned out to be vulnerable to flooding or gas sink. Anyway, about an hour into this one mine I was exploring, I was going through a narrow chasm that was just wide enough to turn sideways and slide through it. If you took a cross-section of the chasm, it would look like a series of hourglass shapes stacked on top of each other. The cave ceiling was wide. It narrowed greatly near my chest, wide by my hips and then narrow by my feet. About 30 feet or so into the chasm, the bottom totally drops away, and I have to press my feet outward against the walls of the chasm to hold me up. All the while I'm still turned sideways, sliding through the upper narrow portion. I can't really see my feet or what I'm pressing against to hold me up, so I kind of just am feeling my way forward. Eventually, one of my feet slips, immediately followed by the other, and I drop down a few inches, catching myself on my wrists and elbows along with the bottom of my rib cage on the skinny part of the hourglass. The position won't give me enough leverage with my arms to pull myself up, so I'm feeling around with my feet for something to stand on. I'm concerned, but not freaking out, but I'm also not able to find something to stand on. Eventually, my arms start getting tired and I start sliding deeper into the skinny part of the hourglass. As I slide lower, I realize that each time I exhale, I drop down an inch or so, and the skinny part of the hourglass is starting to prevent me from fully inhaling. That realization that I can't breathe really triggered a bit of panic, and I start frantically kicking, looking for something to stand on, which just causes me to slide deeper. I'm starting to freak out by this point, and I'm stuck taking half breaths, and I'm thinking I'm either going to get stuck and suffocate, or possibly even worse, I'm going to pass out and drop down into the chasm that I can't see the bottom of. I don't know why it dawned on me, but I put one foot against one wall and the other foot against the opposite side and just pressed as hard as I could to give myself leverage to push myself up and catch my breath. I ended up just using my feet against the wall method to scoot my way forward until I got to where the floor came back up and I could stand and rest. Only then did I actually have room enough to maneuver to get out of there, and the whole thing put me off caving for a long time afterward. Dear viewers, if you'd indulge me, I'd like you to close your eyes, listen to my voice, and imagine something. You are crouched in a dark, dank space, barely the height of a large U-Haul moving truck. The air is hot and stale in your lungs. Your eyes sting from residual dust in the air, and echoing all around you is the sound of sharp metal slamming against rock. Then, all of a sudden, there's a distinct rumbling in the darkness. The tunnel around you trembles briefly, and then there is silence. No voices, no dull sound of a pickaxe against rock. Nothing. But then you hear a noise. Something like a slow exhale at first, but one that gets louder and louder and louder, until it's so loud that it sounds like the roaring of a jet engine. It's the sound of more than 500,000 gallons of water rushing toward you. What follows are the final few seconds of your life, seconds spent in abject terror as you try and fail to scramble for safety. If you found that extremely anxiety-inducing, it's okay. This is just a story. But on September 15th of 2011, this was a nightmarish reality for the miners of South Wales' Gleeson Colliery. The subterranean tidal wave instantly took the lives of 4 unfortunate miners as it tore through hundreds of meters of mine shafts in just 6 seconds. 3 of their comrades managed to escape to the surface before they were drowned, but were forced to endure an agonizing 33-hour wait to learn of their colleagues' fate. The tragedy was caused by work designed to improve the mine's ventilation, which would be achieved by connecting 2 separate shafts. The prospect of flooding is always an ever-present danger in any kind of subterranean excavation, but due to the complex and sophisticated pumping system present in the mine, this threat was thought to be all but nullified. Underground explosions were also commonplace, and a number of safety procedures were in place to prevent any kind of structural instability. Yet on the morning of September 15th, these safety procedures suffered a catastrophic failure. A miner by the name of Nigel Evans had only been employed at the Gleeson for 3 days at the time of the accident. He later described the horror of suddenly hearing a tremendous whooshing noise before feeling an unusual gust of wind flowing down the tunnel. Seconds later, he was greeted by the sight of a nearby lamp shaking furiously as the very earth around him began to tremble. Nigel then saw one of his co-workers, Jake Wyatt, who was crouch running up the tunnel with a terror-stricken look on his face. Jake looked up, saw Nigel, and screamed, "Run!" It was all Nigel needed to hear. "I didn't look back. I just ran out of the main drift as fast as I could go," he later said. As the 2 men ran, Jake began to slow down. By his own admission, he was well past his prime, and the lack of proper oxygen in the mining tunnel made this situation even worse. In the end, Jake was on the verge of passing out, and as he slowed to a crawl, Nigel begged him to keep going. "I kept trying to drag him with me, but he was so exhausted he couldn't speak a word," Nigel stated. "That's when I saw the water rushing up behind him. I've never felt such fear, and I was convinced we were both going to die." The water rushed towards both men, roaring and frothing as it came, but stopped just short of the exhausted Jake. It was nothing short of a miracle. Jake had collapsed just above the waterline. They were saved. The survivors crawled through mud and sludge before they finally saw the light of day. Nigel believed that since he and Jake had gotten out alive, that others might have been lucky enough to escape too. Yet as they reached the waiting paramedics on the surface, Jake's response was like a gut punch of pessimism. "They're gone," he said. "There's no hope for the others." The others he was referring to were 62-year-old Charles Breslin, 50-year-old David Powell, 39-year-old Gary Jenkins, and 39-year-old Philip Hill. And despite the fact that the search and rescue team scoured the 100-year-old mine for 24 hours, no signs of life were ever found. In a heart-wrenching twist, the families of the missing men asked the rescue teams to call off the search. They were all too aware of how dangerous such efforts could be, and were all too aware of the danger their loved ones operated under. To them, the only thing worse than losing their relatives was the prospect of more lives being lost in the recovery efforts. They knew their loved ones were dead, and as one family member phrased it, waiting for the inevitable news was almost unendurable. Mavis Breslin, the wife of one of the lost souls, later said that it was a stressful and never-ending waiting, hoping and hoping that we'd hear something. The tension building up, too, was awful. Specially trained divers were then sent in to see if they could recover any of the bodies, but they were forced back due to silt and debris which made the water far too murky to navigate in. Rescue teams then had the idea to suck out the floodwater using huge pumping systems while simultaneously pumping oxygen into the tunnel system on the off chance that there were any survivors. Gary Jenkins' teenage son Alex later said that, "I didn't sleep for 2 days and the rest of the family were in constant tears. The one or two who had hope were in tears themselves." News of the disasters spread rapidly around the world, and by noon, a veritable media circus had descended on the Gleason mine in order to document the rescue attempts. By the next morning, even the staunchest found their wells of hope were running dry. Mavis Breslin admitted that when they found the first body, it didn't look like they were going to find the others either. You could pick up on the hints. That's when the despair set in. Down at the local community center, as news of the dead came trickling in, a grim atmosphere of hopelessness began to take hold. Lynette Powell had been waiting for news on her husband David, but was advised to go home by the region's member of parliament. "It was the right decision to go home," she later said, "because soon after, we were told that he was gone. From then, we were just numb." By 6 p.m. that day, confirmation came through that the last of the 4 bodies had been recovered, leaving families and rescuers shattered that their efforts were in vain. An incensed public demanded an inquiry be held, but the Welsh Health and Safety Executive said it was too early to determine a possible cause. However, following the release of the official report into the disaster, the mine's manager was arrested on suspicion of manslaughter by gross negligence. Following further investigations, he was charged with 4 counts of manslaughter by gross negligence on January 18th of 2013. Both the manager and his employers were subsequently found not guilty following a speedy trial, yet he remained a focal point for the community's contempt in the years that followed. The day after the disaster, Welsh poet laureate Gwyneth Lewis visited the village and would later write a poem describing the atmosphere she experienced. It's a deeply profound and respectful memorial to those that lost their lives, but 2 lines seem to cry out over the others. "Leaves drift down, but they won't heal. The sentence of the mountain." At the bottom of the western slope of Wales's Taff Valley lies the small village of Aberfan. When Aberfan's coal mine was just dug in 1869, the village consisted of just 2 cottages and a tavern. Yet within just a few generations, the coal industry saw the village's population explode to almost 5,000 people. The first spoil waste from the mine was deposited on the valley's lower slopes just east of the canal, but during the early 20th century, the first spoil tip was started above the canal line on the western slopes of the village. For those that don't know, spoil is the term used to refer to waste material removed during the mining process. These waste materials are typically composed of shale, carboniferous sandstone, and other residues, and take the form of huge black mounds that plunge everything under them in shadow. By 1966, there were 7 spoil heaps surrounding Aberfan village, 5 of which towered above the village itself. The one in usage during that time was known as Tip 7, and unlike the others, it contained a great deal of what was called tailings. Tailings are another type of waste product, only unlike spoil, tailings consisted of fine particles of coal and ash which took on properties similar to quicksand when it became wet. Combine this with the fact that Aberfan receives an average of 60 inches of rain a year, and we start to understand what a delicate, precarious situation began to develop. Between the years 1952 and 1965, there were 11 incidents of severe flooding in the Aberfan area. Residents often complained that the floodwater left a greasy black residue when it receded, which suggested that some of the spoil heaps were becoming increasingly unstable. The local council promised a safety review and urged the owners of the coal mine to consider leveling or relocating some of the taller spoil heaps. The owners promised they'd look into the issue, but behind closed doors, profit was placed above people. To them, it made no economic sense to deal with the spoil heaps, as any kind of concerted effort would cut deep into their earnings. Instead of instant and urgent action, the coal company opted for excuses and delays. To them, anything that affected their bottom line was off the table. The British coal industry was under a lot of strain at the time, and according to them, a dip in productivity might mean the end of Aberfan itself. Yet little did they know, disaster was already looming. October of 1966 saw 6.5 inches of rain fall on Aberfan in just a few days. Then, on the morning of October 21st, workers at the Aberfan coal mine noticed that Tip 7 had started to shift. A few hours later, the rails on which the spoil was transported to the top of the tip collapsed. Workers reported this to the tip's supervisor, but instead of taking urgently needed action, the supervisor simply canceled the remaining day's work and declared they'd wait until the following week to decide on a new place to tip the soil. Miners protested, but management dismissed their concerns, and with that, Aberfan's fate was sealed. Just a few hours later, at 9:15 in the morning, a 30-foot-tall wave of spoil barreled down the hillside at almost 25 miles an hour. The village's occupants said it sounded like thunder or a low-flying jet, with one witness later stating that the previously solid spoil had transformed into a heavy liquid approximately twice the density of water. Others reported that as the wave of spoil crashed down on the hill, it resembled a dark, glistening wave, or a huge black tsunami that swallowed up all it passed over. The wave first crashed into 2 farmhouses that sat just at the base of the spoil heap, instantly killing its occupants. It then ruptured 2 water mains that were buried in an embankment, further saturating the spoil until its consistency resembled quicksand. When the avalanche stopped, so did the noise. One resident recalled that in that silence you couldn't hear a bird or a child, almost as if nature herself had been stunned into silence from the destruction she had wrought. After rupturing the water mains, the spoil wave crashed into Aberfan's Moy Road, home of the Pantglass Junior School. Pantglass served almost 250 of the community's children and was staffed by 5 teachers that day. The children had arrived just a few minutes before the spoil wave hit, and were actually due to finish early that day to make the beginning of the half-term holidays. If the spoil wave had crashed onto the school just a few hours before or after, they'd all have been fine, but that was not the case. Mud and water flowed wildly through broken windows, filling every room in the school with the near-liquid spoil. Exactly 109 children were either crushed or suffocated in a matter of seconds, with all 5 of the school's teachers losing their lives trying to protect them. The acting headmaster of a nearby secondary school was quoted as saying, "The girls' entrance was full of rubble and waste material. I climbed into the rubble in the doorway, and when I looked directly in front of me, I saw that the Moy Road houses were gone." When the tsunami of sludge finally came to a stop, and the shock of what happened had worn off, the residents of Aberfan village rushed to rescue. They began frantically digging through the rubble using nothing but gardening tools or their own bare hands. Horrified citizens made to the local fire and police departments, who rushed to the scene accompanied by gangs of local miners. Yet, when the miners arrived, they discovered to their horror that instead of helping the situation, the amateur diggers were actually making things worse. Without proper planning by qualified engineers, an ad hoc excavation might actually lead to further collapse of the building. The miners rushed to call off the initial dig, before recommencing in organized groups under the control of their pit managers. Not long after digging resumed, the first survivors were pulled out of the black sludge, which by this time had started to re-solidify. They were rushing to a nearby hospital, with the first survivors arriving just before 10 a.m. Within the hour, more than 20 children and 5 adults had been rushed to the local intensive care unit. Rescuers helped to find more, but their hopes were in vain. After 11 a.m., no other survivors were found, and as they dug, the rescuers began to piece together a horrifying picture of the seconds following the spoil slide. Nancy Williams, the school's meals clerk, had sacrificed her own life when she used her body to shield 5 children, all of who survived the disaster. When her body was found, she was still clutching a pound note she had been collecting as lunch money. Rescuers then discovered that the deputy headmaster, a man named Di Benyon, had attempted to use a blackboard to shield himself and 5 children from the slurry pouring through the school. Unfortunately, he had been less successful than his female colleague, as he and his 34 pupils were found to have perished. In total, almost 150 Aberfan residents were killed by the spoil slide, and 116 of those were children between the ages of 7 and 10 years old. Given the extremely tragic and sudden nature of the disaster, BBC News led with the story for its 10:30 a.m. broadcast. The result was that thousands of volunteers traveled to Aberfan from all over Great Britain, some of which helped set up a makeshift mortuary in the village's small chapel. A team of volunteer doctors and coroners began identifying victims, as well as identifying the various cause of deaths. Most had succumbed to asphyxia, fractured skulls, multiple crush injuries, or a combination of all 3. As well as the dedicated medical staff, more than 400 embalmers volunteered to assist with the cleaning and dressing of the corpses, and a contingent that flew over from Northern Ireland removed the seats of their plane to help transport child-sized coffins. On October 27th, a mass funeral for 81 of the children took place. They were buried in a pair of 80-foot-long trenches, with attendees numbering the tens of thousands. Queen Elizabeth had initially neglected to visit the village, and despite seeming cold, this is common practice in order to avoid any kind of heightened hysteria. Yet the tragedy was so profoundly felt by the British people that the Queen actually reversed her decision and made a rare appearance in order to pay her respects. At the mass funeral, the parents' rage was palpable, and when the causes of death were announced by the priest, one man shouted out, "No, sir. My children were buried alive by the National Coal Board." This prompted another person to scream that the National Coal Board killed our children. And as it turned out, this wasn't far from the truth. As Aberfan's Member of Parliament later admitted, he had been afraid to speak out regarding the spoil heap because he feared the entire mine would be closed. As one member of the National Union of Mine Workers put it, if our MP's statement is to be accepted as truthful and accurate, then he bears what must be one of the largest personal burdens of responsibility for the disaster. But without a shadow of a doubt, the real villains of this story are the National Coal Board, who bore overall responsibility for the mine's safety, along with the national media. In the aftermath of the disaster, the head of the NCB went on a tour of British coal fields, giving speeches that prompted the use of coal and condemning the increasing popularity of nuclear power. It was seen as extremely bad taste, with one prominent Welsh politician calling it a disgraceful spectacle. Even more insulting was the NCB's offer of £50 to each grieving family. When this was met with outrage, the NCB upped the offer to £500 each, calling it a good offer. But as one heartbroken parent phrased it, "Trying to put a price on the life of my child is something I'll never be able to forgive." Yet instead of at least trying to understand their pain, the NCB claimed that some of the parents were simply trying to capitalize on the death of their children. However, as the British Journal of Psychiatry later explained, the argument for higher compensation was based around the fact that the Aberfan tragedy imparted a huge amount of post-traumatic stress disorder onto the local community. According to them, the survivors of the disaster were more than 3 times more likely to have developed lifetime PTSD compared to individuals who had experienced other life-threatening traumas. What's more, a third of all survivors still experience bad dreams or difficulty sleeping due to intrusive thoughts regarding the disaster, and in the year that followed, close relatives of the victims had a death rate 7 times higher than the norm. As you can imagine, The psychological effect of the village's surviving children was even more devastating. One of these children was quoted as saying, "We didn't go out to play for a long time because those who'd lost their own children couldn't bear to see us. We all knew what they were feeling and we felt guilty about being alive." Almost 85% of Abafan's children's reported sleeping difficulties, nervousness, difficulty making friends, unwillingness to go to school, and even randomly wetting their pants. One local doctor later wrote, "By every statistic, patients seen, prescriptions written, deaths, I can prove that this is a village of excessive sickness." It should also be noted that despite these problems, the birth rate rose considerably in the years following disaster, and remarkably out of proportion to surrounding towns and villages. In short, this is a kind of deep, psychological programming that's normally triggered by apocalyptic-level disasters, the kind meant to prevent the extinction of the human race. This all played out in the tiny village of Abafan, after a day that for many really was the end of the world. Their world. During the late 30s and 40s, the Canadian city of Yellowknife experienced its very own gold rush. The city grew from a small village into a fully fledged metropolis, all due to the presence of the coveted Oris Rock which lay beneath it. The largest of the town's mines, the aptly named Giant Mine, opened in 1948 and is still churning out gold more than 4 decades later. By 1990, the mine was the basis of Yellowknife's economy and was so lucrative that it was bought up by Peggy Witter, Canada's shrewdest mining executive. Yet just 2 years later, Giant Mine was starting to run down, and when the miners were forced to accept a pay cut, a standoff with the local miners' union commenced. The labor dispute turned ugly from the get-go, with almost 3/4 of the miners voting in favor of strike action. Attitudes on both sides hardened, and the mine soon moved to replace its entire workforce. This kind of drastic action hadn't been taken since World War II, and a legal loophole meant strikebreakers could be employed in the Northwest Territories. These tactics undercut the strike and enraged union members, who hurled insults at replacement workers from the entrance gates and harassed them with air horns at night to keep the crews awake. However, this treatment only seemed to solidify the confrontational atmosphere, and the replacement workers dug their heels in. Soon after, the labor dispute became even more vicious. On the first night of the strike, striking miners set fire to mine buildings, beat up a security guard, and even risked their own lives by destroying a live electrical line. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police responded by bringing in a riot squad, but miners responded by storming the mine while brandishing weapons and balaclavas. The riot was only quelled when federal police fired warning shots, but to the striking miners, this was taken as a declaration of war. 2 men named Al Shearing and Tim Betker formed a group known as the Cambodian Cowboys and began plotting increasingly militant action. Their activities began in earnest when they set off a small bomb on the mine's satellite dish, blowing it to smithereens. They followed up by destroying the mine's ventilation system with an even larger explosive device. Such violent action divided the striking miners, with some even agreeing to take the pay cut before returning to work. Others begged the Cambodian Cowboys to stop the violence before someone got hurt, but as it turned out, they had only just begun. Just before 9 a.m. on September 18th of 1992, 9 miners were traveling in a minecart along a 750-foot stretch of tunnel, when suddenly, everything went black. An explosion ripped through the tunnel, with the shockwave rebounding off the tunnel walls with such force that it turned all 9 miners into mincemeat in just a fraction of a second. When news of the murders reached the community, literal fistfights broke out on the street. The Cambodian Cowboys were the first to be accused, but in turn, they blamed the mining company for a sharp drop in safety standards. However, investigators discovered a blasting cap at the scene, suggesting that the explosion was caused by a homemade bomb. The mining company was no longer interested in resolving the dispute. They had a killer on their hands. The investigation that followed was perhaps the most intense in Canadian history. Although police found little hard evidence pointing to any individual, Al Shearing and Tim Betker were the prime suspects. Yet it wasn't long before the lens of suspicion turned to 49-year-old Roger Warren. Warren was a veteran miner, known as Ace for his skill in blasting and breaking rock, and although he wasn't a suspect during the initial phases, the investigation soon uncovered some chilling information. Warren once expressed his disgust for the rule that made it illegal for replacement workers to take the strikers' job, and supposedly boasted of setting the bomb that killed the 9 innocent miners. As a result, Roger Warren was put on trial for murder in September of 1994, and as part of a plea deal, the jury was shown a police video of Warren escorting investigators through the bomb site, all while explaining in detail how he had set the bomb. Just 4 months after the trial began, Warren was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Yet in a shock twist, Warren claimed he was completely innocent of all charges and that he had been pressured into the confession by the RCMP. Warren officially appealed his criminal case in 1997, but his conviction was upheld. From prison, he maintained his innocence for almost a decade and made a general appeal for legal aid in his fight for justice. Lawyers with the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted examined his case but ultimately decided against taking up the case of trying to exonerate him. The reasoning behind their decision became abundantly clear in 2003 when Warren confessed to the crime all over again, stating he had recanted his confession at his trial because he couldn't bear to have my family think I could do such a stupid thing. In 2014, after 18 years in jail, and despite vehement objections from some of the victims' families, Roger Warren was granted day parole and eventually released, aged 70 years old. He told his parole hearing that he was sorry for all the pain he'd caused, but it was pain that should have never been inflicted in the first place. Through the violent tribalism that had arisen as a result of the labor dispute, Roger saw his victims as treacherous turncoats. They betrayed their cause, turned their backs on their brother miners, and in doing so, had forfeited their very lives. But no matter how legitimate the strikers' grievance was, these so-called scabs were still men just like them. Men who needed to feed their children and provide for their families. Men who sought to rediscover the dignity of hard work. Yet in the end, Roger Warren made sure that all they found down in Giant Mine was wrath, vengeance, and death. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about all the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, #slinging slasher booty shorts 420 booty wizard.